Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13, we're looking at verses 5 through 10. And we have been talking about the beast. That's what chapter 13, at least the first half. The first half of chapter 13 is about the beast in regards to the Antichrist. And so we're going to pick it up in verse 5, go down through verse number 10 of Revelation chapter 13. Verse 5, "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." And then it says this as kind of an ender here. "If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." And we'll stop right there. And so we see here, verse number 5, we see the time given and the character of the beast. And so we've already seen this last week, how the Antichrist, this beast, is to be a blasphemer. We saw that in verse number 1. But now we see that kind of amplified, as it says, a mouth is given to him for the purpose of blasphemy. And so now, interestingly, the fact that he is given a time of operation here, which is 42 months there in verse number 5, suggests that this is not actually Satan who is giving it to him. Let me explain this. That we don't, or rather, I don't believe that this can be Satan, because if this were Satan giving him this time, he would never limit it. He would not say, you have 3.5 years. He would say, you have all the time you want, go, because this is his man. This is his right-hand man. And so the time that's given to him is not given to him by Satan. It is given to him by God. And so therefore we see that God, as sovereign, gives him a time to operate and a mouth to speak blasphemies. And what I mean by that is that essentially God grants him the ability to say whatever he wants with no constraint. Thus the words of blasphemy are simply the natural words of Satan as he powers the Antichrist. Now, I'm not saying that God is powering this man, but I'm saying that God is placing a time limit on his kingdom, on his sovereignty. He is placing, or rather removing any kind of restraint to the words that he might say in blasphemy. But we understand, we've already seen this last week, how it is Satan that is actually powering him and giving him the means by which to operate. And so we see that, again, and I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but blasphemy is a key cornerstone of this man's kingdom. Daniel 7:8, we see that he's going to have a mouth speaking great things, and that's great things. There's a reference to the blasphemous things he would say. Daniel 7:11, "And I beheld them because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake." And we talked about several weeks ago, but the horn there is in reference to the Antichrist. And the same thing, great words of blasphemy. Daniel 7:20, "A mouth that spake very great things." Daniel 7:25, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High." And so there we see specifically, it talks about the blasphemous things that he's going to say. And why does he do all this? And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but he does this because this is the heart of Satan, right? Satan is a blasphemer. Satan wants to be God, and therefore he's going to say these kinds of things because, again, he's going to have a little bit of power here at the end of the tribulation that he's never had prior to this particular point. And so let's go on, and I want to look at a particular event, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we've talked about it a lot in detail in previous studies, but we read a quote here from John Walvoord. He says this: "It is evident that blasphemy is not an incidental feature of his kingdom, but one of its main features. And he is described in verse 6 as blasphemy against God, against the name of God, and against the tabernacle of God, as well as against them that dwell in heaven. As Satan's mouthpiece, he utters the ultimate in unbelief and irreverence in relation to God." Now, in the ultimate blasphemy, the ultimate situation in which this is played out will be when he sets himself up in the temple at Jerusalem in order to be worshipped. This is kind of the pinnacle of the blasphemous things that he's going to do. And we, of course, again, like I said, I know we've talked about this a lot in the past, but just to give you a couple of verses here that reference this. Daniel 9:27, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. We're referring to here to the event referred to as the abomination of desolation, that point in the tribulation, that midway point in the tribulation where up to that point the Israelites have been going back to Jerusalem in the temple that they're going to rebuild, and they've been sacrificing, and they've been carrying out their religion as they would have done thousands of years ago. And now he's going to stop that. He's going to cease all the sacrifices, and he's going to set himself up in the temple as that which is to be worshipped. And then, of course, Paul references this as well in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He says, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called a god, or that is worship. And here's what he says, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And so, of course, again, this is kind of the pinnacle of blasphemy that the Antichrist will be involved with when it comes to the tribulation. And this is an event that is set in the timeline of the tribulation. We know when this is going to take place, when the tribulation starts. We can't say now, but we know that the tribulation from Daniel 9, and there's a lot in that prophecy that we don't have time to get into, but we know from Daniel 9 that the tribulation begins with a 7-year treaty signed with Israel. And so when that treaty is signed, the tribulation does not begin with the rapture. The tribulation begins with that treaty. For all we know, it happens on the same day. I don't think it will, but that's just my opinion. The tribulation begins with that treaty. And when that treaty is signed, you can kind of set a clock. It is 7 years that is left. And at the 3.5-year mark, at the midway mark, this particular event is going to take place, the abomination of desolation. Daniel says that it happens in the midst of the week. Half of 7 is 3.5. And again, I don't have time to get into all of that, but we understand when he says week, he's referring to a week of years or 7 years. John says here in our text that he now has 42 months left to operate there. At the end of verse 5, he says, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. 42 months is 3.5 years. This is the midpoint of the tribulation. Now, as I said, I'd come back to this, but this perfectly fits in with Satan's character in the original fall. And we read this in Isaiah chapter 14. In Isaiah 14, in reference to the fall of Satan, it says this, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? He says, how art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? And then you see here from these phrases that are going to come out, the heart of Lucifer when he fell. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. Then he ends with this, I will be like the Most High. This has been his desire since day one that he was created. This has been his desire. He wants to be like the Most High. And so he falls. We understand that a long time ago, before creation even happens. He falls, and now he's had this plan, and his plan is going to culminate with this man in the end times, the Antichrist, who's going to be his right-hand man, literally empowered by him, who's going to speak these blasphemous things, the same kinds of things that Lucifer said when he fell originally. And so again, basically all of history between Lucifer and between God and Jesus and God's people, all of it is kind of just moving towards this particular point in time when all of this is going to take place and, again, culminate in this last 3.5-year time period that is the Great Tribulation, the time that Jesus himself says is unlike any other time that's ever been. And so to move on here, we see there in verse number 7, and it was given unto him to make war with the saints. And so it is after this abomination of desolation that he shows his true colors. Now, why I say that is because we understand in the first 3.5 years there will be relative peace. People will, for the most part, be able to kind of do what they want, worship how they want, go where they want, do all of these things, with some exceptions. But what happens at this particular point where, and we'll see this later on as we go on, particularly chapter 17, but the Antichrist will come in, he will destroy the system of religion that had been taking place in that first 3.5 year period, and now he demands worship. It's no longer kind of do what you want. Now it is, you will worship me, take the mark, or die. That's how things are going to go. And so now he's attacking the woman of chapter 12. He's attacking those who are saved. He's attacking the saints. In Daniel 7, again, Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, it says that he shall wear out the saints the Most High. We've seen in chapter 6, we've seen in chapter 7 of Revelation how there are countless numbers of people who are going to be martyred in the tribulation period. And so the text says that the Antichrist will overcome them there in verse number 7, that he will overcome them. Now, overcome, that word there, does not mean that he is going to overcome their faith. He can't. He doesn't have that ability. But what that means is that they are going to be martyred, and in large degree that is going to happen. But we know this in Romans chapter 8. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? It says, as it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. Now, we can take comfort in a text like that. Even in a situation where, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when we get into our prayer request, but even in a situation now where we don't really face that much persecution. Even in a situation like that, we can rest in a text like this. But imagine yourself now, or rather in this particular time period. Imagine yourself in the Great Tribulation. Imagine yourself under the rule and the reign of the Antichrist during the Great Tribulation. You can take comfort in a text like this in ways that we really can't right now. Because they are going to face all of these particular things. Everything that Romans 8 there lists right there, they're going to be facing in degrees that have never really been happened before in the history of mankind. And so they're going to have to place their faith in Christ because, again, the decision is going to have to be made. I don't know that anybody is going to last through the tribulation without having to make this particular decision, take the mark or not. Maybe some will escape that particular thing if they flee, like we saw in chapter 12, they flee with Israel. Perhaps some will escape that decision, but I think by and large, most people are going to have to make this decision. Now, we're going to take the mark that we'll see at the end of this chapter, and we're going to take the mark or not. And if you don't, the decision has been made. The decision right there is martyrdom. And so his power, his authority, all of this will be global. And we know this already, but all of this is going to be global. It says there at the end of verse 7, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. That doesn't leave anybody out. And so this is going to be a global authority, a global kingdom, a global power, and everybody is going to be forced into this, into the worship system of the Antichrist that we're going to see in the last 3.5 years. And so that leads us right into verse number 8. It says, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. Now, I'll say this. Let me read this verse here. So we see that his conquest goes beyond simple politics. Yes, he's going to be the political ruler of the world. That's going to happen. But it's going to go beyond that, as the world doesn't just live under his rule, but they will be forced to worship at his feet. And so for a lot of people who haven't really thought through all of this, I think a lot of people are going to take this mark just simply because of the system that's going to be in place at the time. It's going to be you don't buy, you don't sell, you don't do anything without this particular mark. And so a lot of people are going to take this not so much because they love the Antichrist and because they want to fall at his feet and worship, but they're going to take it just because it's the easiest way. Now, once you take that mark, as opposed to some who I greatly respect, but as opposed to some, I am of the opinion that you don't get a second chance once that mark is taken. I don't believe that. And so once that mark is taken, you have, for lack of a better phrase, you've chosen your side. Okay, and so by that point that is instituted, you will have chosen who you're going to follow. It may not be because of blind devotion, but you have made your particular decision. And so all the world is trapped in this system of politics and religion, but there is one important exception, and we see that at the end of verse 8. And so it says that all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. We'll see later. You could basically say the same thing. All that dwell upon the earth shall take the mark of the beast. Again, we'll see that at the end of this chapter. But with one exception, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And so the one exception to this are those whose names are in the book of life. Now, Revelation chapter 20 makes it clear what that book of life is. It says in Revelation chapter 20, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And so you have the book of life, and if your name is in the book of life, you are not cast into the lake of fire. So this makes it pretty obvious for us. Who is those names in the book of life? It is the names of all believers of all time. All believers of all time, their names are written in the book of life. And so John's point here, is that the worship of the beast is incompatible with your name being in the book. And so if your name is in the book, you don't take the mark. If your name is in the book, you don't worship the beast. If your name is in the book, you don't fall in line with the religious and the political system that's going to be taking place in the Great Tribulation. You're separated. You're like 1 Peter says. You're like a stranger. You're a foreign. You're a pilgrim, because that's not for you. Okay? This is for something else. And so everybody whose name is in this book, they're going to be as opposed as they can be to the system that's going to be taking place in that day. And so furthermore, we just kind of as an aside here, we see in this particular title for Christ the eternal nature of God's plan of salvation, right? What does it say there at the end of verse 8? Whose names are not written in the book of the Lamb slain when? From the foundation of the world. And so, again, I know this isn't really in line with what we're talking about in Revelation here, but it does well for us to understand this. God was never surprised by the fall, right? When Adam and Eve fell in Genesis chapter 3, God is not up in heaven thinking, what in the world am I going to do now? He created Adam and Eve full well knowing that was coming, knowing that was going to happen, knowing that he was going to have to sacrifice that animal, knowing that the law was going to be interpreted, knowing that he was going to have to send Jesus to the cross. All of this happened in the foreknowledge of God, because we see here again from the foundation of the world. He was never surprised by this. His plan to redeem was made before there were people to redeem. All of this took place from before the foundation, before creation ever took place. And we see this even more clearly in 1 Peter chapter 1. It says, for as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, and then look at this, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. And this has been God's plan since before creation ever even took place. And so before any of that happened, God knew that we were going to fall. God knew that there was going to be sin in the world. God knew that he was going to have to send his son to the cross. God knew all of these things. And I'll just say this, from the perspective of those who are going to be in this particular time and reading this as the tribulation is going on, what a tremendous comfort that must be to them, knowing that God knew all this was going to happen long before it took place. God knew I was going to be here. God knew I was going to be saved. God knew all of this. And so that must be a tremendous comfort to the people who are actually taking up the book of Revelation, reading it while all of this is taking place, and knowing that, man, God is still sovereign. God's got us in his hands. He hasn't forgotten us. All of this is in his holy will and his holy plan. And so John ends this particular section with kind of a word of warning here. In verse number 9, and we saw a similar phrase in all of the 7 letters to the churches. And I know that was a long time ago. But back in chapters 2 and 3, every letter ended with a phrase such as this: if any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. And so, as I said, he gives kind of a word of warning here. And so those involved with the Antichrist system of persecution, and that's really what it's going to be. It is a political system, yes, but it is a system of persecution, a system of martyrdom. Those who are involved with this particular system, they will be judged and punished by God. And so, again, we saw this back in chapter, I believe, 7, where the saints are crying out, when is our blood going to be avenged, essentially? Well, it's going to happen. It might not happen as quickly as people want, but it's going to take place. And so we see that in a word, this is John Walford, in a word, it is the law of divine retribution. Those who persecute the saints and lead them into captivity must in turn suffer the righteous wrath of God. However, and I'll end with this, it is also a word to the saints alive at that particular time. Again, we have to remember, they will have this. They will have the book of Revelation. Jesus said his word will never pass away. Try as hard as they might. And I didn't even intend to bring this up, but we've seen just this past week people burning Bibles in Seattle. Like, this stuff happens. They will try to get rid of the book. They will not succeed. God's word will not pass away. They will, in one form or another, whether it's by book, whether it's digital, whatever the case may be, they are going to have the word of God to look, to study, to read. They're going to have Revelation chapter 13. They're going to be able to turn here and read this. And so it's going to be a time or a word of comfort also to them who are alive. And so, again, try to envision yourself there. Try to place yourself there while all of this is taking place, and perhaps having the thought that as bad as all this, maybe God is just kind of maybe he's just kind of forgotten us, or maybe he's just turned his back on us, or maybe he's just thought, it's so bad, and I had a plan, but I've changed my mind. I'm going to do something different. Well, I think that hopefully what they will see in this is a word of comfort. And so while it may be the Antichrist leading into persecution, again, as I said earlier, all of this is taking place within the sovereign hand and will of God. Again, he knew it. It's his plan. It's taking place exactly as he wants it to take place. And so Christians living at this time don't need to wonder whether God has forsaken them. This is all part of his plan. It's all there. This is what he wanted to happen. And so therein lies the phrase there, the patience and the faith of the saints. Those who lead into captivity will go into captivity. Those who kill with the sword will be killed with the sword. Well, what does that in turn mean? That there are going to be people led into captivity. That there are going to be people killed with the sword. Right? That is going to happen. If people are killing with the sword, that means people are being killed with the sword. Well, who are those being killed? It's Christians. It's God's people. And so they can't be killing if there's no one to be killed. And so this is all part of God's plan. And so I'll end with a quote here by David Hughes. He said, though they are viciously attacked by the Antichrist and his followers, the saints of God must keep steadfast faith in the ultimate justice of God. He will reward their persecutors with persecution of his own. And so, and we'll see part of that as we get over into chapters 19 and 20. We'll see a little bit of that with regards to the Antichrist and the false prophet as far as a persecution or a vengeance being God's. And so we'll see some of that take place later on in the book.